to Coffee Nick's Movie Picks, a bold blend of coffee and movie review podcasting. My name is Nick Delaney, and I'm your show host, coffee and movie aficionado, and the guy who thinks we live inside a dream. In today's episode, we will be celebrating the life of David Lynch with the discussion of David Lynch, The Art Life, a documentary film. We'll be pairing this discussion with a review of the Sidamo coffee from Sidamo Coffee and Tea on the H Street corridor in Washington, D.C. Please take a seat, stay a while, and let's talk David Lynch over some coffee. This is the show's first ever documentary episode, which I think is very exciting. I love documentary films, and I really want to talk about them more on the show, but I just haven't found the opportunity yet, and I think this is a great opportunity. And I took this documentary filmmaking class in my senior year of college, and I just fell in love with storytelling in documentaries and also just the technical and artistic aspects of documentaries. I think that a documentary film can be so much, and I think that David Lynch, The Art Life is a great example of everything that a documentary film can be. So I'm very excited to get into this. But really, I want to use this episode to honor the life of David Lynch. This episode is dedicated to him. I think that this is a great opportunity to just talk about him. I know that so many people listening to this podcast probably have some sort of attachment to David Lynch. He has such an impact on so many people who are creatives or people who enjoy art. He's so influential and such a brilliant mind and a source of creativity and inspiration for so many of us. And really a cornerstone of this podcast too. One of the first episodes we had was his Dune movie, which was not a good start for him on this podcast, I will admit. But later we had Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, I've talked about Twin Peaks every single episode, I think, of this podcast. So it just felt very necessary that I find a moment to talk about David Lynch and pay respects and just talk about his life and talk about my attachment to David Lynch. So this episode, this will be more of a discussion rather than a review. I think that this documentary film allows for a lot of discussion about David Lynch to be had. Getting right into things, our first segment is the Now Brewing, and this is a luxury coffee discussion and review segment. Now brewing in today's episode is the Sidamo coffee from Sidamo Coffee and Tea on the H Street corridor in Washington, D.C. I know that was a mouthful. I've been meaning to try this place for such a long time, and I was just having a day, and this was shortly after David Lynch passed away, actually, and I just needed to get out of the house. So I went out on a little walk around D.C. H Street corridor is, that's like a good 30 to 40-minute walk from my house, but it was just lovely outside, so I figured why not explore the city a little bit. And I saw this place was nearby, and I knew I wanted to try it, so the opportunity presented itself. But talking about this coffee house a little, it is so charming, and this is such a gem. This just seems like a local treasure. And it just had such a nice and cozy atmosphere inside. I love the outside too. They had like this big, almost like a coffee pot on the outside. It was just very charming. And the inside is very cozy, small, intimate, but it's just very nice. They have like their entire menu written on chalkboards, and you could just tell that this coffee shop is so loved and lived in. Every single table was full. I had to kind of like wait around to get a table. But there were just so many people there just enjoying being with one another and connecting. And that's the type of thing you want to see in a coffee house. That's how you know a coffee house is creating like a good atmosphere. And it's not just sort of like a grab and go coffee house. So I really appreciated this. And also they had signs up that were saying like, sit with someone. If the tables are full, find someone to sit with. So make new friends, which I think is lovely. So talking a bit about this Sidamo coffee. So the Sidamo, that is actually named after the Sidama region of Ethiopia. And that is a regional state in southern Ethiopia. I think I've talked about an Ethiopian coffee on this podcast before, and I can't remember which one that was. But for those of you who have not heard it, Ethiopian coffee is by far one of my favorite coffee regions. They just have like the most unique and delicious tasting coffee, and it's, I don't know, it's the most flavorful and impactful coffee that you'll have. But coffee in the Sidama region is the most popular agricultural product of this area. And it's the main source of income for this area, too. It's a very, very important crop to them. And the Sidama region actually leads Ethiopia in coffee production. This is the largest place to get coffee in Ethiopia. And talking a little bit about this brew of Sidamo coffee that I had at Sidamo Coffee House, it was delicious. It was so good. And I don't know, this is the type of place to go to and just get black coffee, because it's just that unique and that flavorful. The body of this coffee was extremely rich and complex, and there was a very vibrant aftertaste. It was very acidic, and usually I'm not all about acidic coffees, but when it comes to a coffee like this, I love it. But it was great. The Sidamo coffee is considered a staple in Ethiopian coffee, as far from what I've read. And I could definitely see why. There was sort of like these citrusy and herbal taste to the coffee. It was just very good, very unique, and just like a flavor that I'll remember. And I think that this was just a great coffee to talk about on the David Lynch episode, because I don't know, I this is just the type of episode where I had to talk about black coffee. I feel like, David Lynch, coffee is very important to him. You see it in Twin Peaks a lot. And we're also going to talk about coffee in relation to this movie a little bit in a few minutes. But he definitely seems like the black coffee type. I can't see him getting like a white mocha with caramel drizzle and whipped cream and all that. So I wanted something to kind of match that well, and I thought that this was a perfect one. Another thing about Sidamo Coffee and Tea on H Street is that their coffee is all roasted daily in-house, which is really, really cool. And that is because they are dedicated to just quality and giving you the best coffee you can have. So applause to them for that. I think that that is an indication of a really good coffee house, and you can tell that people love the coffee because that place was so crowded. So props to Sidamo Coffee and Tea. I did not try anything else here. I only had this one cup of coffee, so I'm really excited to go back and try one of those sugary drinks, or to try their tea even. I'm not much of a tea drinker, but I will do it. So I'm very excited to go back. If you are in the area, I highly recommend checking this out. It is a lovely little spot to go catch up with friends. Very, very cozy and very unique. So I'm going to give the Sidamo coffee from Sidamo Coffee and Tea the Nick pick. All right, and moving forward, this next segment is the coffee thought, and this is an outlet dedicated to voice my many incoherent thoughts over a lovely cup of coffee. So, being how this is an episode about David Lynch, and we're going to talk heavily about his creative process and just his life as an artist and creative, I wanted to talk a little bit about creativity too. And this is something that's just on my mind a lot. It's something I think about all the time. The first thing I will say is that I think it is very, very important for people to balance creating with consuming. And consuming, I'm going to clarify a bit. That's a term we use a lot in like the communication field when I was in college. That sounded very snobby saying it out loud. But, consuming, I mean like watching shows, playing video games, reading books, you're consuming media. I think it's very important that we are striving to create as much as we consume. And I think, in order to create things, you have to consume things. And I think, in order to consume, there has to be a balance. But it is overwhelming how much media there is out there. Especially like if you're like me, you love to watch TV shows, you love to see every movie in the theaters, you love to read books here and there, you love to play video games. There is just so much media and it's overwhelming. How do you watch all of these things? How do you play every video game? How do you do everything? And the answer is you're not meant to. You're not meant to. You will stumble across, you'll pick up whatever you're meant to see at that time in your life, and that's just how it is. And you're going to die with a long watch list or backlog of video games or whatever. It's depressing, but it's just how it is. You will die with a watch list of like 600 movies on Letterboxd. It will happen. So it's so easy to get very engrossed in all of these things that we need to consume, especially when we have people in our lives telling us like, oh, you have to watch this, you have to watch that, which is great. And sometimes that leads you to, discovering your new favorite thing. But it is very overwhelming. And if you're like me, you get very lost in consuming and you get frustrated that you don't have the time to create things. And it's hard to find that balance. It's like, when do you carve out time in your day when you have a full-time job to create things? And it's also hard because in the full-time job, I'm creating things there. That's not nothing. I do marketing, so I create like graphics and I create writing and I do and podcasts for my full-time job. And so I am creating things within that job, but it's not necessarily like things that are incredibly personal. And I have a desire to create things that are personal. But, when you get home after a long day of work, you kind of just want to kick off your shoes and watch something. You want to just tune out and be a very like passive consumer. So what does that leave you? It leaves like nights and weekends. Greta Gerwig movie shout out. It leaves nights and weekends for you to create things. And most times I just spend those times consuming things. I think it's very daunting. I think at least I feel a pressure to create things, especially reviewing movies. You always hear those lyrics or whatever that's like, they don't build statues of critics. I'm not saying I want a statue built of me ever, but, you definitely want to like leave some sort of legacy. So creating is a very daunting thing. It's very intimidating. And it's like, I could think like maybe I'm just at the time of my life where I'm supposed to be consuming all these things and the creating will come later. But how you live your days is how you live your life. Oh my gosh, it's crazy. There's so much back and forth. And it just really feels like there's not enough time in a day. So I guess this coffee thought is more of a question to audiences, to listeners, to you. If you are a creative, when do you find time to create? How do you balance that with consuming things? Where do you find the time? I'm really curious. I have several ideas of things that I like to create, but it's also hard to get started on those things because it's like, how do you elaborate on an idea? Because I don't know, my ideas kind of come up in like, I think of the subtext of like a movie idea first, or I think of just like a general sort of concept, like an abstract concept. How do you build off of that? That's another thing. Like I was watching Monsters Inc. the other day and I was like, what was the first idea in this movie? Was the first idea like, what if the monsters in the closet were real? Or was the first idea of like, what if there was a world of monsters? Or what if the first idea was like, I want to build some complicated commentary on like energy and like using natural resources and expending resources and like the ethics of that, because that's what that movie is about. It's kind of a political movie. Where did the ideas come from? It is so overwhelming to me. I feel like I will never be able to like create a film, it's so daunting. And it's like, how do I, at this stage in my life, tap into that? If I had to answer these questions, I think it is to just do it. I think it's to just do it with the resources that you have. Make that movie, even if it's like, you're casting your friends and you're recording it on an iPhone and you don't have microphones and everything. Just make the movie. Just make the movie. I mean, you see that all the time with like these directors where you're like looking at like their first project and it's, you know, like a short film version of the movie you just saw. It's like crazy. So I think the answer is just to do it. And I think that's what I need to do. But it's also, how do you just do it? Where do you start? It's a very daunting process. And I hope you guys listening, or at least the creatives listening, can relate to this. Yeah, so scary. But yeah, that's my coffee thought. And I will get into the movie now. But now showing this week on today's episode is our feature ideological analysis and critical film review segment by yours truly. Now showing on today's episode is David Lynch, The Art Life. David Lynch, The Art Life is a documentary film that features interviews with Lynch as he recounts important life moments, his journey as an artist, and his outlooks on creativity. This is a really cool documentary because, in a lot of interviews with David Lynch, he kind of has a habit of shutting down the interviewer. And it's usually not in regards to his personal life, but it's usually the interviewer trying to ask him exactly what he meant by a certain film. And David Lynch will be like, I'm not going to answer that. Or the movie is the movie. It explains itself. And the one I'm thinking of currently, he just says in an interview that Eraserhead is his most spiritual film. And the interviewer is like, oh, elaborate on that. And he's like, no. And that's just how he is. He never wanted to disclose how he felt about a film or how he interpreted his own films. He was very serious. Anyone that knows him knows he was very serious about allowing audiences to interpret his films completely. And he really didn't reduce the room for them to interpret the film at all. He tried to leave them as much room to interpret as possible. And that is something that I deeply appreciate about Lynch and his films. I know this means that some of his films can be viewed as, a little bit inaccessible or strange or hard to wrap your head around. And that's true, but I think that what he means in his films is what you see. I'm a firm believer that Lynch, as a filmmaker, his filmmaking and his like messages in his films, they're more simple than they're made out to be. I think that his films are quite straightforward and like really what his films mean are what you make of them. Of course, I think that as an artist, he has his own interpretations of his films, but I also think I like to think that he doesn't even think that his own interpretations of his films are like the interpretation. Like they are exactly like they're what the film means. I think that he also believes that the film is dependent on the viewer, which I think that's really cool that Lynch allowed that space for his viewers. And I think that a lot more filmmakers these days need to do that. But yeah, this documentary, it was just, it's an hour and a half of Lynch talking about his life as an artist. And he talks about his childhood. He talks about his family. He talks about some really dark and interesting things. It's a very vulnerable documentary as well. And he talks about his trouble with school. He really has a deep hatred for school. But eventually he ends up at a filmmaking school in California, which was just right for him. And that's when he made Eraserhead. And that's what the film goes up to. It's really just his life from childhood to Eraserhead. And really, what I like about this documentary is that the whole, I guess, narrative that the directors and Lynch creates are sort of a build up to Eraserhead. And it explains everything that came before. And really, I think this film just feels like a love letter to Eraserhead. Like in that interview, Lynch said it is his most spiritual film, and I can absolutely see that. It's personally one of my favorites of his. So I really love that this movie, this documentary, you know, just shows so much of Lynch's life and delves into him as a person, him as a son, a father, an artist, a painter, a musician, and all these different things. It's just lovely to see, and I think that this documentary in the future will just be like such a such an excellent way to remember Lynch. There were some really interesting things about Lynch's childhood in this movie. I really liked hearing about his parents and his relationship with his mother and father. There were some interesting things there. He had a lot to say about his mother and how he thought his parents were the best parents in the world. It's so sweet. And his mother was just always wanted the best for him. And sometimes it came off pretty harsh, but he always knew it meant well. And his dad, he also had a really deep sense of appreciation for his dad as well. He talked about how his dad would walk to work in a 10-gallon cowboy hat and a uniform, and it used to be the most embarrassing thing. But as he grew up, it became really cool. And he looked back and he's like, oh, my dad is the coolest. There was also a moment when Lynch was a part of a studio, the Bushnell Keeler studio, and he would spend a lot of his time there, and he would even be there like late into the night. And David Lynch's father told him, you have to be back before 11. And he was a teenager at this time, and David would say like, no, I have to be out past 11. I'm not going to be back by 11. And David's father told him like, okay, well, you're no longer going to be a part of this family. And it was, David Lynch described it as like one of the hardest, most crushing things he's heard in his life. And Bushnell Keeler, the studio owner, contacted David Lynch's father and was like, hey, this is like everything to him. He's here working. He really is so passionate and cares so much about painting and his art. I just wanted you to know that. And his dad, took it back, I guess. So I think that was a really cool moment too. And it just shows like how early on in David Lynch's life he was just dedicated to living the art life. Another moment with David's father that I thought was really interesting is when David lived in Philadelphia, and his dad was visiting town, and David took his dad down into his basement of his apartment to show him what he described as his experiments. And David Lynch was talking through the interview, and he was saying how this was like, all these things he picked up off the street. There was like a dead rat and a dead bird and like all these little pieces of trash and like all these things he collected that he thought were really interesting, that inspired his work. And he showed this to his father, and they were going up the stairs from the basement where this collection was, and David turned around to look back at his father, and he had this horrible expression on his face. And later that day, David's father said, Dave, I don't think you should ever have children. And I thought that was really interesting as well. And David said like, oh, wow, like in that moment, I realized my father thought I was like not right in the head. Like I was, I was not well, and I was like threatening or something. And just like funny enough, at that time, David Lynch's girlfriend just happened to be pregnant and no one knew. Just very ironic. But I thought that moment was really interesting as well, because it sort of represents this borderline between an artist and, a concerning individual. Because, if you come down and show someone like dead birds and rats in your basement, that for a lot of people would raise several red flags, but in the context of David Lynch, it inspired his art. So it's very strange, that border between artist and concern. And I think David Lynch represents like the artist side, obviously. But I think that says so much about his art in a very strange way that's hard to describe. One other interesting moment from David Lynch's childhood was when he had what he described as a dreamlike experience as a child, where he was in a court playing with his brother, I think, and he saw a woman naked on the street outside. I think she was sitting on the curb, and he was just very like scared of this, and it really shook him to his core, and I think in many ways drove his art, in his adulthood. It was this experience. I just thought that this was an interesting thing to mention. I think that this makes sense with a lot of David Lynch's work. This experience, it sort of like represents some of the jarring moments or some of the more disturbing moments in his work, or like, yeah, those dreamlike moments where it just doesn't seem, something's not right, something doesn't feel real. I was really surprised to find out that David Lynch lived in Virginia, which, as you know, I'm a Virginia born and raised local. And not only that, he lived in Alexandria, Virginia, which is from my place in DC. That is like a 20-minute drive on a good day. So that's really crazy. So a lot of his life was spent in the DC area, and he would go out, having fun in DC with friends and everything. And the studio that he was a part of, the Bushnell Keeler studio, that was in Georgetown, which was really cool. So I didn't know that so much of David Lynch's life took place in DC. I thought that was really cool to find out. Maybe there's like a David Lynch walking tour I could do. I don't know. That would be really cool. And there definitely would be a market for that. But just very cool to hear that. It was also in DC that David met Bushnell Keeler, and learned a lot about what he described as the art life. He describes the art life as, quote unquote, you drink coffee, you smoke cigarettes, and you paint. Girls come into it a little bit. So that's the art life to David Lynch, and honestly, that sounds so lovely. I wonder when he found the time to do all that. I need to partake in this art life, I think. I already have the coffee part down. I'm not a painter, but I have the podcast and everything. So later in his life, he moved to Boston because he thought it was just a cool place to be. And he ended up hating it. And there was one memory he described in this like Boston chapter that I thought was just very funny. But he was at a Bob Dylan concert, and he was high at the concert, and he was at the very, very, very back of the theater. And he, I guess, got freaked out or something because he was with a girlfriend, I think, and he was freaked out because of how small Bob Dylan looked on stage. And he's like, oh, he's the size of my finger. And he walked out of the Bob Dylan concert, and his roommate at the time said, dude, you don't walk out on Bob Dylan. And David Lynch said, quote, I walk out on Dylan, get the fuck out of here, end quote. Yeah. I mean, David Lynch, everybody, just iconic. You know that the iconic David Lynch voice, he just has like that way of speaking. I think it's so mesmerizing. And listening to this documentary just be narrated by David Lynch, I was obsessed with it. The way he tells stories is so engaging. And, he could talk very much like me, where, for example, he could say, oh, I went to dinner that night and I had this and this, and yeah, it was pretty cool, blah, blah, blah. But instead he's like, it was 10:30 that night. It was dark out. I had dinner. Like, it is very like rigid in a way, but not rigid like it stops you. It breaks the engagement. enhances it. Like, it's so interesting. Like, I wonder where he gets that from. And like, I just love it. And he just has like such a smooth, deep voice. It's just so nice to listen to. After Boston, though, he went to Philadelphia, which he describes as a horrible, horrible, scary, frightening place. It was really not funny, but I mean, funny, and I guess not like a laugh out loud way, hearing him describe this place. He described all of these awful people that he came into contact with. His neighbors at his first place in Philly, there was a what he described as a racist woman neighbor who reeked of urine. And there was a woman pretending to be a chicken in her backyard who came up to him one day saying how her nipples hurt. She was saying, and he does this imitation in the documentary. She was like, "Ooh, my nipples hurt. My nipples hurt." And like coming up to David very uncomfortably, squeezing her breasts at David, like very weird. I mean, this feels like a continuation of what his childhood memory he shared of that completely naked woman on the street in his suburban neighborhood. This is just kind of like very jarring, weird stuff that he witnessed in Philadelphia. There was also, he was passing some woman on the street, and he was like, "Oh, have a good day." And the woman was with her baby, and she turned to her baby and she told the baby, "If you ever grow up like that, I'm going to fucking kill you." Like, really just vicious scariness happening in Philadelphia during the time of David Lynch. But he went to school in Philadelphia, and this was one of his positive school experiences, it seemed. He said the students were great, and the art spirit was alive and well. David Lynch said, quote, "Philadelphia was what started. It was so good for me, really, really good. Even though I lived in fear, it was thrilling to live the art life in Philadelphia." And you can tell how that translates into his art, living in fear, but it being really good for you. That is just sort of like his work, like you know, just this overarching sense of dread, but, some like good things happening within that dread, or, like his classic sort of trope of like a really beautiful exterior with like something dark underneath the surface, like Blue Velvet or Twin Peaks. So yeah, it seems like Philadelphia was the start of like a lot of his creativity. And I think Eraserhead takes place in a very dystopian Philadelphia. So you could sort of see like that imagery there. This is also where he had his iconic quote unquote "a moving painting" moment, where he was sitting at his cubicle working on a large painting, and he leaned back and he felt and heard wind and saw the painting move, and he thought, a moving painting. And that is what famously got him into filmmaking. And from there, he made The Alphabet, and then he won a grant and made The Grandmother. And then he went to film school in California and made Eraserhead, which he describes as one of the most beautiful moments of his life. And like it was its own little world. And there was this one moment that I thought was really interesting, where he said his brother and father visited him in California and told him to give up because Eraserhead was never going to happen. He should just quit and find another profession. And he was so conflicted by this, and he felt so distraught, but he knew that he just could not give it up. I think that this is a really just interesting moment for any artist. I think that I love this about this documentary. It shows, David Lynch, although he is this legendary artist, he is just like any other creative, and he struggles with the same things. In some ways, any artist could feel like what they're doing is not valid work, or it's not, lucrative, therefore not worthwhile in this society. And I felt like that sometimes too. And there's growing up, you say you want to do this or you want to do that, and it feels like a childish dream, and people tell you it's a childish dream or it's not going to get you anywhere. And I think that that's really upsetting, and that's something you shouldn't say to people. Like, you shouldn't say like this, that's a kind of a faraway dream. It's very far fetched. It's not achievable, because you could be clipping the wings of like a future artist. You never know. You have to let people try things. You have to let them like see for themselves if it works or not. You could be, I don't know, shunning the world from a future artist. So I am really inspired by that David Lynch had the dedication and the passion and the self-awareness to say, no, this is for me. This is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it. Because if we know one thing about David Lynch, is that he is stubborn. If we look at Twin Peaks, we know about the whole revealing the killer situation. Even in Twin Peaks The Return, there were moments where his crew was trying to tell him like, this scene needs to be shorter, and he'd be like, fucking A, man. Don't tell me how short a scene needs to be. Fucking A. Just, and of course, Inland Empire is just Inland Empire. So he's just a very unapologetic artist, and I think those are the best artists. So something I take away from this film, and something that David Lynch as an artist has taught me, is to just be very stubborn about what you're passionate about. Just go do it. To me, he is just like the guiding star of creativity and originality. I think that he's not only an outstanding artist, but he's also just a genuine and lovely human being. And I'm so upset by this loss, but I think that he has given us so much and taught us so much throughout his work. And we are lucky enough that so much of that work actually teaches us about grief and overcoming sort of like horrific losses or trauma. I mean, I think about Twin Peaks a lot, and especially the ending of Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. I won't spoil anything, don't worry. But it's such a horrifically dark story that manages, in the end of Fire Walk with Me at least, to show a silver lining or a glimmer of hope for what we thought was a doomed character, a character who was doomed since before the show even started. And I think that that is beautiful storytelling. I think that much like every other film lover, I think that David Lynch is a genius. We were so lucky to have him. I, Beyond lucky. I don't even know how else to put it. There will never be anyone else like him. We will never have any work, any pieces of art like his art, ever. But we are so lucky to have what we have of David Lynch's, and his legacy will live on forever because his art is so unique. It simply cannot go away. It has infinite meanings. It's just so beautiful. Gosh, what like a past 2 weeks this has been. It's just been too much happening. All right, and I think that wraps up my discussion on David Lynch, The Art Life. This is an excellent documentary. I guess talking about this documentary, it does not wrap up my discussion. Talking about this documentary on like a technical level, like just as a film of itself, because I just kind of like used it to talk about my experience with David Lynch and a bit about his life. Talking about like the technical aspects of this film, I think that it is great. I think this is a great documentary. I love how much childhood photos it shows of David Lynch. Like, you get to see him growing up, you get to see him like making Eraserhead and all these different things. But I also love how much it shows his art, especially art that is related to the different times of his life the film is discussing. And it doesn't just like sort of like flash through his art like a slideshow. It really focuses on different pieces of art and really shows the detail, because there is so much to look at in his art and there's so much to feel. So I think that this documentary really paid respect to his art, especially his paintings. I think painting was the focus of this documentary, which I was surprised by. It didn't go as heavily into filmmaking, but his background is being a painter. So I think that this perfectly illustrated his background before he sort of became a household name. And it was also just really beautiful to see David Lynch spend time with Lula, who is his youngest daughter. It was just really cute. You know, a lot of the kind of B-roll of the movie is David Lynch in his home studio painting and everything, and you could just see him being a father to Lula. It's really beautiful. It's so sweet. And like I said, that this film is going to be like is going to become like a really great way to remember Lynch by, and to like look back and reflect on his life. So I really like that this film exists. I think it is great. Yeah, it is an excellent documentary. It taught me a lot. Our next segment is Dear Coffee Nick. In this segment, I read some letters from fellow coffee and movie enjoyers about their own coffee and movie opinions, reviews, thoughts, hot takes, or whatever. We do not have any letters this week, but if you would like to send one in, please feel free to write Dear Coffee Nick through DM on social media or email coffeenicksmoviepics@gmail.com. I am accepting any sorts of comments, questions, reviews. You could write like your own little coffee reviews, your own movie reviews, and send them in, and I will read them out and discuss them. You could send just like random thoughts or just anything you want to. Please, please. I love getting questions. All right, everyone. Thank you again for listening to Coffee Nick's Movie Picks. Before you go, please be sure to follow at Coffee Nick's Movie Picks on Instagram and at Coffee Nick on Blue Sky. There you can stay up to date on everything related to the show. If you like what you heard, please rate the show on your podcast app of choice and share the show with your friends. I had a wonderful time making this episode and just reflecting on the life of David Lynch. I love that this episode gave me the opportunity to learn even more about him. So thank you for tuning into this episode. I hope that for those of you who also had an attachment to David Lynch, that this episode was comforting as well. So thank you for listening. And in the future, I'm absolutely going to be discussing more David Lynch films, maybe even a Gretathon style series. We will see. I'll have to do some planning about that, but I think it would be a lot of fun. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you again in 25 years. Meanwhile, thanks again for listening to Coffee Nick's Movie Picks. Our opening theme is The Moondrops, and our closing theme is March of the Hares, both songs by Nathan Moore. Before you go, please be sure to follow the show on social media at Coffee Nick's Movie Picks on Instagram and TikTok, and give the show the Nick Pick by rating it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thanks again, and see you next time.